I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding clothes, or heading home after a long day. The weight of invisibility pressed down like fog over San Francisco Bay. Maria Elena Vasquez had learned long ago that some people look right through you, as if your hands, your heart, your very existence were nothing more than background noise. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding laundry, or coming home from work, staring at the clock after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. The number 47 bus wheezed to a stop at the corner of Mission and 24th Street, its diesel fumes mixing with the aroma of fresh tortillas from the taqueria below. Maria Elena stepped off, her worn leather purse clutched tight against her chest, containing everything that mattered: her mother's rosary, a faded photograph of her daughter Sophia, and exactly $37, enough for groceries until Friday. The morning fog clung to the city like a gray blanket, but in the Mission District, life pulsed with vibrant defiance. Mariachi music drifted from open windows, children's laughter echoed from playgrounds, and the scent of cilantro and lime filled the narrow streets. But Maria Elena's destination lay worlds away from this warmth. Each morning, she boarded the 38 bus toward Pacific Heights, watching the city transform before her eyes. The colorful murals gave way to pristine brownstones, the corner bodegas replaced by boutique cafes, where a single cup of coffee cost more than she spent on food for an entire day. By the time she reached the mansion on Broadway, the fog had usually lifted, revealing a world of manicured gardens and iron gates that seemed designed to keep people like her on the outside. The Caldwell estate stretched across nearly half a city block, its Georgian architecture imposing and cold. Maria Elena had walked these streets before, cleaning houses for wealthy families who barely acknowledged her presence. But this house felt different. It wasn't just the size, though at 8,000 square feet it dwarfed most San Francisco homes. It wasn't the value either. Though she'd overheard whispers that Richard Caldwell's net worth exceeded $50 million, his fortune built through decades of real estate investments and tech stock portfolios that had weathered every market storm. What set this house apart was the silence that seemed to seep from its very bones. Richard Morrison. Caldwell III stood at his office window on the 3rd floor, watching the city wake up below. At 52, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that filled boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals with a handshake. His investments in cryptocurrency had proved particularly lucrative. His Bitcoin holdings alone were worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. Yet for all his financial success, for all the properties scattered across California and the dividend checks that arrived like clockwork, Richard felt bankrupt in the ways that truly mattered. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days had passed since Catherine walked out. She'd left no note, no explanation beyond the divorce papers that arrived a week later. Their 20-year marriage had crumbled not in explosive arguments, but in the slow erosion of silence. Emma, now 17, moved through the house like a ghost, her once bright laughter replaced by the soft click of her bedroom door closing. Jack, 15, had retreated into video games and rebellion, his grades slipping as steadily as his father's hope for reconciliation. The house that had once bustled with dinner parties and holiday gatherings now echoed with the hollow sound of footsteps on marble floors. Staff members came and went with alarming frequency. Housekeepers quit without notice. Cooks complained about the oppressive atmosphere, and even the gardener had mentioned finding other work. Richard's wealth could buy him the finest furnishings, the most advanced security systems, and servants to maintain his lifestyle, but it couldn't purchase the one thing he'd lost: the ability to create a home. Maria Elena knew none of this history when she rang the service bell that first Monday morning in October. She'd applied for the position through an employment agency that specialized in placing domestic workers with high net worth families. The pay was substantial, more than she'd earned in her previous 3 jobs combined. But the agency director had warned her that the Caldwell household was challenging. 4 housekeepers had left in the past year, each citing the family's emotional climate as unbearable. Mrs. Patricia Reynolds, the head of household staff, answered the service door with the expression of someone perpetually disappointed. In her 60s, she'd managed wealthy homes for 3 decades and prided herself on maintaining order in chaos. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her black uniform was pressed to military precision. She looked Maria Elena up and down with undisguised skepticism. "You're the new girl from the agency." "Gosh," she said, the words falling flat as statements rather than questions. "I suppose you think you can succeed where others have failed." Maria Elena nodded respectfully. "I'm here to work, Senora. Nothing more, nothing less." Mrs. Reynolds led her through a maze of service corridors that ran like hidden veins through the mansion. The kitchen was a masterpiece of European design. Marble countertops imported from Italy, copper pots that gleamed like mirrors, and a commercial-grade refrigerator that could have stocked a restaurant. Yet despite its grandeur, the space felt sterile, unused except for the basic necessities of keeping a family fed. "Mr. Caldwell expects perfection," Mrs. Reynolds explained as they walked. "Every surface must shine, every detail must be attended to. The children are not your concern. They have their own schedules and commitments. Your job is to maintain the household areas, the main living spaces, guest rooms, and family areas. You'll work Monday through Friday 7 to 5 with an hour break for lunch." The tour continued through rooms that seemed frozen in time. The formal living room contained furniture that looked as though it had never been sat upon, its silk cushions perfectly arranged and dust-free. Oil paintings worth more than Maria Elena's annual salary hung on walls that had heard more whispered conversations from staff than laughter from family. Each room told the same story: wealth without warmth, luxury without love. As they climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, Maria Elena caught glimpses of the family she would serve. Through an open door, she saw Emma hunched over textbooks at a desk that probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent. The girl looked up briefly, her green eyes meeting Maria Elena's for just a moment before turning away with practiced indifference. Down the hall, the muffled sounds of video game explosions came from what Mrs. Reynolds identified as Jack's room. "The children keep to themselves," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice carrying a note of approval. "Mr. Caldwell prefers it that way. Less disruption to his schedule." They paused outside the master bedroom, its double doors closed. Mrs. Reynolds lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Caldwell's private quarters are off-limits unless specifically requested. He works from home most days, managing his investment portfolio and handling business calls. His assets include properties in Napa Valley, Lake Tahoe, and Manhattan, so there's always something requiring his attention." Maria Elena nodded, filing away each instruction with the careful attention of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. Jobs like this didn't come often to women with her background. At 49, she'd spent 30 years cleaning houses, caring for children, and keeping other people's lives organized, while her own remained a careful balance of survival and sacrifice. At exactly 7:30, Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maria Elena's car was worth. He moved with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to making every minute count, his phone already pressed to his ear as he grabbed a cup of coffee Mrs. Reynolds had prepared. "The Shanghai markets opened strong," he was saying, "but I want to diversify more into European stocks before the close. Yes, move the Bitcoin holdings into that new fund we discussed." He paused, seeming to notice Maria Elena for the first time. Their eyes met briefly, his sharp and appraising, hers steady and respectful. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge her presence without quite welcoming it, then continued his conversation as he headed toward his home office. This would be her world for the foreseeable future: early mornings on crowded buses, long days polishing surfaces that reflected lives she could never live, evenings returning to her tiny apartment where the walls were thin but the love was abundant. Maria Elena had learned not to expect warmth from the wealthy families she served. Respect would be enough. Dignity in her work would sustain her, and if she was very lucky, she might even earn enough to help Sophia through her final year of community college. But as she began her first day in the Caldwell mansion, carefully dusting priceless objects and mopping floors that echoed with emptiness, Maria Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this house needed more than cleaning. It needed healing. And despite every instinct that warned her to keep her head down and her heart protected, she found herself wondering what had wounded this family so deeply that their enormous wealth couldn't buy them even a moment's peace. The real test would come not in her ability to maintain their physical surroundings, but in whether she could survive the emotional winter that seemed to have settled permanently over their lives. In the Mission District, people believed that homes had spirits, that houses could be blessed or cursed by the love or pain that lived within their walls. As Maria Elena worked through that first morning, she began to understand that she had entered a house where hope had frozen solid, and no amount of money seemed capable of bringing back the spring. Mrs. Reynolds monitored Maria Elena's every movement during those first weeks, her sharp eyes cataloging each task with the precision of an accountant tallying assets. The head of staff had seen countless domestic workers come through the Caldwell household, and she'd developed a sixth sense for identifying those who wouldn't last. Usually, it was the house's oppressive silence that broke them first. The weight of serving a family that seemed to exist in separate bubbles of misery proved too much for most employees to bear. But Maria Elena moved through her duties with a quiet steadiness that surprised even Mrs. Reynolds. She arrived each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, her work uniform, a simple navy dress with comfortable shoes, always clean and pressed despite its obvious age. She spoke only when spoken to, asked no unnecessary questions, and completed her tasks with an efficiency born of decades of experience. Most importantly, she seemed immune to the emotional toxicity that had driven away her predecessors. The other staff members watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. James, the elderly butler who'd served the family for 15 years, had grown cynical about new hires. "They all start the same way," he muttered to Mrs. Reynolds one afternoon as they watched Maria Elena carefully arrange fresh flowers in the main hallway. "Eager, respectful, professional. Give it a month and she'll be complaining about the atmosphere just like the rest." Cook, whose name was actually Margaret, but who'd been called simply Cook for so long that most people had forgotten her real identity, was less diplomatic in her assessment. "She's too quiet," she declared while preparing Mr. Caldwell's lunch. "Mark my words, the quiet ones are always plotting something. Probably thinks she can worm her way into this family's good graces and get herself some kind of inheritance." These whispered conversations never reached Maria Elena's ears, but she felt their judgment nonetheless. She'd worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the hierarchy that existed among domestic staff, the way suspicion and competition could poison relationships between people who should have been allies in their shared experience of service. She kept to herself, ate her simple lunches alone in the small staff room, and focused on the work that brought her a paycheck every 2 weeks. The Caldwell children proved as emotionally distant as their father. Emma moved through the house like a beautiful specter, her long blonde hair always perfectly styled, her clothes bearing the labels of designers whose names Maria Elena recognized from magazines but whose prices she could never afford. The girl attended an exclusive private school in Pacific Heights, participated in activities that required constant transportation to various upscale neighborhoods, and maintained a schedule so packed with obligations that she rarely spent more than a few hours at home each day. Jack was Emma's opposite in almost every way. Where she was polished and controlled, he was deliberately disheveled, his dark hair perpetually messy, his clothes chosen for comfort over style. He attended the same private school but seemed to view it as a prison sentence, his academic performance hovering just above the minimum required to avoid serious consequences. Most afternoons, he disappeared into his room with fast food and video games, emerging only for reluctant appearances at family dinners that occurred in almost complete silence. Richard himself remained largely invisible during Maria Elena's first month of employment. She would see him briefly in the mornings as he prepared for his day of managing investments and business calls, catch glimpses of him in his home office, reviewing financial reports that detailed asset allocations across multiple portfolios, or notice his silhouette at the window as he spoke into his phone about market fluctuations and profit margins. He never addressed her directly, never acknowledged her presence beyond that initial nod, never seemed to register that a new person was now responsible for maintaining the physical environment where he conducted his isolated existence. The house itself seemed to resist Maria Elena's efforts to bring life into its spaces. Each morning, she would carefully arrange fresh flowers in the crystal vases scattered throughout the main rooms, only to find them wilted by evening despite adequate water and light. The expensive sound system that could have filled the mansion with music remained perpetually silent. Even the kitchen, despite its restaurant-quality equipment and carefully stocked pantry, felt more like a museum display than a space where a family gathered to share meals and conversation. It was the small details that revealed the depth of the family's disconnection. Mail piled up unopened on the hall table, not bills or business correspondence, which Richard handled meticulously, but personal letters and invitations that suggested people still cared enough to include the Caldwells in their lives. Family photographs had been removed from common areas, leaving behind faded rectangles on wallpaper where happy memories once hung. The children's bedrooms contained everything money could buy, but lacked the personal touches that typically made such spaces feel like home. Maria Elena began to notice other signs of a family in emotional freefall. Emma's bathroom cabinet contained prescription bottles for anxiety medication, their labels bearing dates that suggested she'd been struggling with stress for months. Jack's room reeked of marijuana, though he was careful enough to limit his usage to times when his father was occupied with business calls. Richard's home office contained empty bottles of expensive whiskey hidden behind law books, evidence of a man self-medicating his pain in the privacy of his personal space. The staff's gossip gradually revealed more details about the family's recent history. Catherine Caldwell had been a prominent figure in San Francisco's social scene, her charity work and cultural patronage making the society pages with regularity. Her departure had been sudden and complete. No explanation to friends, no forwarding address, no attempt to maintain relationships with people who'd considered her a close friend. The divorce settlement had been generous, reflecting Richard's desire to end the marriage quickly rather than engage in prolonged legal battles that might expose his private business dealings to public scrutiny. She took nothing but her clothes and jewelry, Mrs. Reynolds confided to Cook during one of their afternoon conversations. Left behind artwork worth millions, furniture she'd personally selected, even her car. It was like she wanted to erase every trace of her life here. Cook nodded knowingly. When a woman walks away from that kind of money, you know the pain must have been unbearable. Rich or poor, we all have our breaking point. Maria Elena absorbed these fragments of information without comment, filing them away as she slowly pieced together the puzzle of the Caldwell family's dysfunction. She'd worked for enough broken families to recognize the patterns. Wealth that complicated rather than simplified relationships, success that came at the cost of emotional connection, and children who inherited their parents' pain, along with their financial advantages. But she also recognized something else in this house, something that made her daily bus ride from the Mission District feel less like a journey between worlds and more like a mission. Despite their wealth, despite their privilege, despite their ability to solve almost any problem with money, the Caldwells were suffering in ways that seemed tragically familiar to her. Loss, abandonment, and the desperate search for connection were emotions that transcended economic boundaries. The mansions might be different, but the human heart's capacity for breaking was remarkably consistent across all social classes. As October turned to November, Maria Elena began to sense tiny cracks in the family's carefully maintained emotional walls. Emma had started leaving her bedroom door slightly ajar while doing homework, perhaps unconsciously seeking the comfort of knowing someone else was nearby. Jack's video game sessions had grown quieter, less aggressive, as if he too was beginning to crave the peace that Maria Elena's presence seemed to bring to the household. Even Richard had begun acknowledging her with brief nods when they encountered each other in the hallways. Small gestures that suggested he was at least aware of her consistent presence in his disrupted life. These subtle changes gave Maria Elena hope that her instincts had been correct. This family didn't just need a housekeeper. They needed someone who understood that the most important cleaning happened not with mops and dust cloths, but with patience, consistency, and the quiet strength that came from having survived one's own share of heartbreak. She'd learned these lessons in her own life, through her own losses, and now she found herself wondering if perhaps she'd been brought to this cold mansion not just to earn a paycheck, but to offer something far more valuable than perfect housekeeping skills. The transformation began so gradually that even Maria Elena didn't recognize it at first, like the way fog lifts from San Francisco Bay, not all at once, but in gentle layers that reveal familiar landscapes in new light. The Caldwell household began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. It started with the kitchen. Maria Elena had always believed that food carried love in ways that words sometimes couldn't express. In her own tiny apartment, she would spend Sunday afternoons preparing meals for the week ahead, her small stove producing aromas that could transport her back to her mother's kitchen in Guadalajara. The scents of cumin and oregano, the sizzle of onions hitting hot oil, the careful balance of flavors that could transform simple ingredients into celebrations. These were the languages of comfort she'd learned as a child. The Caldwell kitchen, despite its expensive equipment and fully stocked pantry, had become sterile and functional. Cook prepared meals according to a rotation of recipes that prioritized nutrition and convenience over pleasure. Breakfast was typically granola and fruit, lunch was salads or sandwiches, and dinner was lean proteins with vegetables, all perfectly adequate but devoid of the warmth that turned sustenance into nourishment. One particularly gray morning in November, Maria Elena noticed Emma rushing through the kitchen with nothing but a cup of coffee, her face pale with the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept well. The girl paused at the counter, swaying slightly, and Maria Elena realized she was probably running on caffeine and anxiety rather than actual fuel. Without asking permission, Maria Elena opened the refrigerator and began gathering ingredients. Eggs, cheese, the sourdough bread that came from an expensive bakery but rarely seemed to be eaten. Her movements were sure and practiced as she heated a pan, whisked eggs with cream, grated cheese with the efficiency of someone who'd been cooking since childhood. The aroma that began to fill the kitchen was rich and comforting, completely different from the usual sterile efficiency of morning meal preparation. Emma stopped at the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar smells. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice carrying the cautious curiosity of someone afraid to hope for something good. "Scrambled eggs," Maria Elena replied simply, not turning from the stove, "with a little cream and cheese. My daughter Sophia always said they were better than any restaurant." She plated the eggs on thick slices of buttered toast, the yellow creamy against the golden brown bread, and set it at the counter with a napkin folded beside it. Emma approached slowly, as if the simple meal might disappear if she moved too quickly. She took a bite, then another, and for the first time since Maria Elena had been working in the house, she saw the girl smile. Not the polite expression she wore for her father or the practiced social smile she used with friends, but something genuine and surprised. "This is really good," Emma said, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she'd forgotten that food could be more than fuel. Jack appeared in the doorway, drawn by the conversation and the lingering aromas. His hair was messy from sleep, and he wore the same clothes he'd had on the day before, but his eyes were alert with curiosity. "What smells so good?" he asked, then stopped when he saw his sister actually eating breakfast instead of rushing out with just coffee. Maria Elena didn't ask if he wanted some. She simply prepared another plate, adding slightly more cheese because she'd noticed he was still growing and probably needed the extra calories. She set it beside his sister and returned to cleaning the pan, giving both children space to eat without feeling observed or judged. The silence that fell over the kitchen was different from the usual suffocating quiet that pervaded the house. This was comfortable, peaceful, the kind of silence that allowed people to be present with each other without the pressure of forced conversation. Emma and Jack ate slowly, seeming to savor not just the food but the unexpected pleasure of sharing a meal that someone had prepared with care rather than obligation. Richard appeared in the doorway just as the children were finishing. He stopped when he saw them sitting together, actually eating rather than grabbing food on the run, and his expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been wistfulness. Maria Elena glanced at him, then quickly prepared a third plate without being asked. "I don't typically eat breakfast," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes we don't know we're hungry until someone feeds us," Maria Elena replied gently, setting the plate on the counter and retreating to give him space to make his own choice. He sat beside his children, and for perhaps 10 minutes, the Caldwell family shared a meal in something approaching peace. No phones, no rushed conversations about schedules, no tension crackling between them, just 3 people eating food prepared with love, allowing themselves to be nourished in ways that went beyond simple nutrition. When they finished, Emma looked directly at Maria Elena for the first time since she'd started working in the house. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. That was really nice." Jack nodded agreement, his mouth still full of the last bite. Even Richard paused before leaving for his office. "That was thoughtful," he said quietly, and though the words were formal, his tone suggested genuine appreciation. After they left, Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the kitchen, her expression unreadable. "I hope you don't think you're supposed to be cooking now," she said stiffly. "Cook handles all meal preparation." "Of course," Maria Elena agreed respectfully. "I just noticed the children hadn't eaten, and there were eggs that needed to be used before they spoiled." It was a careful lie, diplomatically phrased to avoid direct confrontation while making her point. Mrs. Reynolds seemed to recognize the political skill in the response and nodded approvingly. "Just remember your place," she said, but her voice lacked its usual edge. That afternoon, Maria Elena found a jar of homemade salsa and a package of fresh tortillas in the refrigerator. Gifts from her neighbor, Mrs. Gutierrez, who always cooked too much and liked to share. She left them on the counter with a small note, "In case anyone gets hungry before dinner." When she arrived the next morning, the jar was empty and sitting clean in the dishwasher. Emma was waiting in the kitchen, dressed for school but not rushing for once. "Do you think," she asked hesitantly, "you might make those eggs again sometime?" Maria Elena smiled, her first genuine expression of joy since starting work in the Caldwell house. "Whenever you're hungry," she assured the girl, "food is meant to be shared." It was a small beginning, but Maria Elena had learned that the most profound changes often started with the smallest gestures. A warm meal, a moment of care, the simple recognition that everyone, wealthy or poor, needed to be nourished in body and spirit. The Caldwell mansion was still cold, still filled with the echoes of loss and disappointment, but now there was at least one room where warmth was possible. And in her heart, Maria Elena began to hope that warmth, like the aroma of cooking food, had a way of traveling through even the most carefully guarded spaces, reaching people who had forgotten they were hungry for something more than money could buy. The changes continued with the subtlety of seasons shifting, almost invisible until suddenly the differences became undeniable. Maria Elena began staying an extra 15 minutes each morning, not for overtime pay, but to ensure Emma had something substantial to eat before school. She discovered that Jack responded better to food that felt casual and unstructured. Quesadillas he could eat while gaming, fruit smoothies that didn't require sitting down or acknowledging that someone was caring for him. Richard proved more complex. His eating habits reflected the controlled precision with which he managed every other aspect of his life. He preferred his coffee at exactly the right temperature, his toast cut diagonally, his eggs cooked until the whites were set, but the yolks remained slightly soft. These weren't demands he voiced, but preferences Maria Elena observed and quietly accommodated, understanding that small consistencies could provide comfort to someone whose life had been disrupted by profound loss. The house began to smell different. Instead of the antiseptic scent of expensive cleaning products, warm aromas drifted from the kitchen at unexpected times. The fragrance of baking bread on Sunday mornings, the rich smell of soup simmering for hours, the sweet scent of cookies cooling on racks, These were the signatures of a home where someone cared enough to create comfort through food. Mrs. Reynolds initially disapproved of what she saw as Maria Elena overstepping her boundaries, but even she couldn't argue with the results. The children came home from school more regularly instead of finding excuses to eat elsewhere. Richard began working from the kitchen table some afternoons, his laptop and financial reports spread beside the fresh fruit Maria Elena arranged each morning. The formal dining room, unused for months, was gradually being reclaimed for actual family meals, rather than serving as an elegant storage space for mail and packages. But the real breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in December, when everything in the Caldwell household seemed to converge into a moment of unexpected grace. Emma had arrived home exhausted from a particularly demanding day at school, her upcoming finals weighing heavily on her already anxious mind. Jack was struggling with a history project that he'd procrastinated on until the last possible moment. Richard was dealing with a significant downturn in one of his investment portfolios, the kind of financial stress that reminded him how quickly fortunes could shift. The house felt particularly oppressive that evening, the weight of individual struggles combining into a shared sense of overwhelm. Maria Elena was preparing to leave for the day when she noticed the family's separate suffering. Emma sat at the kitchen counter staring blankly at textbooks. Jack was in the living room surrounded by scattered papers and research materials, and Richard paced in his office while speaking tersely into his phone about moving assets and minimizing losses. Instead of leaving, Maria Elena quietly began preparing a meal that required no special occasion. Chicken and rice, simple and nourishing, seasoned with the cumin and garlic that reminded her of home. She worked steadily, the familiar rhythms of cooking providing a meditation that calmed her own spirit while filling the house with welcoming aromas. Emma was the first to notice. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the scents and the quiet sound of sautéing vegetables. "You're still here," she observed, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. "Sometimes we all need a little extra care," Maria Elena replied, stirring rice into the fragrant mixture of chicken and spices. "Bad days happen to everyone." "Is it okay if I stay here while you cook?" Emma asked, her voice small and uncertain. "I mean, I won't get in your way or anything." "Of course, mija," Maria Elena assured her, using the endearment without thinking. She set a glass of water beside Emma's books and continued cooking, her presence providing a calm backdrop to the girls' studying. Jack appeared 20 minutes later, his research crisis temporarily abandoned. He perched on a bar stool watching Maria Elena's efficient movements with the focused attention he usually reserved for video games. "How do you make it smell so good?" he asked. "Practice," she answered with a smile, and a little bit of love mixed in. When Richard finally emerged from his office, he found his children in the kitchen with Maria Elena, all three of them working quietly. Emma reviewing notes, Jack organizing his research materials, and Maria Elena ladling rice and chicken into serving bowls. The scene was so normal, so reminiscent of the family life that had existed before Catherine's departure, that he stopped in the doorway and simply observed. "I made enough for everyone," Maria Elena said gently, not pushing but making the invitation clear. They ate together in the breakfast nook, the first complete family meal in the Caldwell house since the divorce. Conversation was tentative at first. Emma mentioned a teacher she liked, Jack complained about the difficulty of his assignment, Richard shared a brief story about an amusing client phone call. Nothing profound or deeply personal, just the ordinary exchanges of people sharing space and food and time. But as the meal progressed, something shifted. Emma began to relax, her shoulders losing their perpetual tension. Jack actually laughed at one of his father's stories. Richard looked directly at his children instead of past them, seeming to really see them for the first time in months. Maria Elena said little, but her presence anchored the conversation, her quiet contentment giving the family permission to enjoy this simple pleasure. "This is really good," Richard said, and his voice carried surprise, as if he'd forgotten that food could be satisfying rather than merely functional. "It's my mother's recipe," Maria Elena explained. "She used to say that some dishes heal from the inside out." After dinner, something unprecedented happened. Instead of scattering to their separate spaces, the family lingered in the kitchen. Emma helped clear dishes without being asked. Jack actually engaged his father in conversation about the investment losses, showing a surprising understanding of financial markets. Richard asked Maria Elena about her mother, then listened with genuine interest as she shared memories of a woman who had raised 5 children on a secretary's salary but had never let them go hungry or unloved. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Richard said when Maria Elena finished her story. "She taught me that taking care of people isn't just a job," Maria Elena replied. "It's a way of showing love, even when you can't say the words." The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had occurred in the Caldwell house since Catherine's departure. Richard found himself talking about his own mother, who had died when he was Emma's age, leaving him to navigate adolescence and young adulthood without the grounding influence of unconditional love. Emma shared her fears about college applications and the pressure to live up to her family's expectations. Jack admitted that he'd been smoking marijuana not because he enjoyed it, but because it helped quiet the constant anxiety that had plagued him since his parents' divorce. These weren't dramatic confessions or emotional breakthroughs, but they were honest moments of connection between 3 people who had been living in isolation despite sharing the same address. Maria Elena listened without judgment, offered gentle words when appropriate, and mostly provided the safe space that allowed them to risk being vulnerable with each other. When the evening finally ended, Richard found himself experiencing something he'd almost forgotten: contentment. Not the satisfaction that came from successful business deals or profitable investments, but the deep, quiet pleasure of feeling connected to his own family. As he helped Maria Elena load the dishwasher, a domestic task he hadn't performed in years, he realized that her presence was changing more than just the household's meal routines. "Thank you," he said as she gathered her purse and coat. "For dinner, I mean, and for everything." Maria Elena nodded, understanding that his gratitude extended far beyond the meal itself. "Family is important," she said simply. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us how to be together." As she walked to the bus stop that night, Maria Elena reflected on the evening's unexpected grace. She'd seen glimpses of the people the Caldwells could be when they felt safe enough to let down their defenses. Richard wasn't just a wealthy businessman, insulated by privilege. He was a man who had built financial success as a fortress against emotional pain, but had forgotten how to live inside it. Emma wasn't just a privileged teenager with anxiety issues. She was a young woman trying to figure out her identity while carrying the weight of her family's dysfunction. Jack wasn't just a rebellious adolescent acting out. He was a sensitive boy who needed structure and guidance but had been afraid to ask for help. The bus ride home to the Mission District felt different that night. Instead of the usual exhaustion that came from spending 8 hours maintaining other people's lives while neglecting her own, Maria Elena felt energized by the possibility that she might be making a real difference in the Caldwell house, not just keeping surfaces clean and meals prepared, but helping a broken family remember how to heal. She thought of her own daughter, Sophia, studying late into the night at community college, working toward a nursing degree that would lift her into a more stable financial future. Sophia had grown up watching her mother clean other people's houses, care for other people's children, sacrifice her own dreams, to ensure her daughter had opportunities she'd never enjoyed. Now, perhaps, Maria Elena was discovering that all those years of service had prepared her for something more meaningful than she'd ever imagined. The lesson she was learning in the Caldwell mansion was one she hoped to share with Sophia someday. That love expressed through service wasn't a sign of weakness or subservience, but a form of strength that could transform not just the recipients, but the giver as well. In choosing to care for this wounded family, Maria Elena was discovering parts of herself that had been dormant for years. The teacher, the healer, the wise woman who understood that sometimes the most profound gifts come disguised as ordinary moments around a dinner table. December brought an unexpected warmth to the Caldwell mansion, not from the heating system or the fireplace in the living room, but from the gradual thawing of relationships that had been frozen for too long. The changes were subtle but unmistakable, like the way Emma had begun leaving her bedroom door open while studying, or how Jack had started asking Maria Elena about her childhood in Mexico, or the way Richard would sometimes pause in his business calls when he caught the scent of something delicious drifting from the kitchen. The house itself seemed to be responding to the shift in emotional temperature. Rooms that had felt like museum displays were slowly becoming lived-in spaces again. Books appeared on side tables instead of being shelved away immediately. Flowers lasted longer in their vases, as if they too sensed the growing warmth. Even the expensive sound system was occasionally turned on, filling the mansion with soft jazz that complemented rather than competed with conversation. Maria Elena had developed a routine that went far beyond her official job description. She arrived each morning with small gifts from her neighborhood, fresh tortillas from the panaderia on Mission Street, herbs from Mrs. Chen's garden, sometimes just interesting stories about the characters who made the Mission District feel like a village within the city. These offerings weren't charity or attempts to curry favor, but genuine expressions of a woman who had discovered that sharing her world enriched everyone involved. Richard found himself looking forward to these glimpses into Maria Elena's life outside the mansion. Her stories of neighborhood potlucks and community celebrations, of helping elderly neighbors with grocery shopping and translating documents for recent immigrants, painted a picture of a world where people took care of each other not from obligation, but from genuine connection. It was a stark contrast to his own social circle, where relationships often felt transactional and conversations revolved around business opportunities or market predictions. One afternoon in mid-December, while reviewing his investment portfolio in the kitchen, Richard found himself asking Maria Elena about her financial situation. Not from nosiness, but from growing concern about the people whose lives had become important to him. "Do you have retirement savings?" he asked, then immediately felt awkward about the question. I know it's not my business, but I've been thinking about employee benefits and whether we're providing adequate support." Maria Elena paused in her task of organizing the refrigerator, considering how to respond to this unexpected inquiry. "I have a small savings account," she said carefully. "Not much, but enough for emergencies. My daughter Sophia is almost finished with her nursing program, so soon I won't need to help with her expenses." Richard nodded, making mental notes about establishing better retirement benefits for household staff. His wealth had insulated him from understanding how precarious life could be for people who depended on hourly wages and had no investment portfolios to cushion unexpected financial shocks. The conversation planted seeds of ideas that would later bloom into concrete actions, but for now, it simply represented his growing awareness that the people who worked for him were complex individuals with their own dreams and challenges. Emma, meanwhile, had begun seeking out Maria Elena's company in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. The girl who had previously buried herself in academics and extracurricular activities as a way of avoiding emotional engagement was now drawn to the kitchen during her study breaks, finding comfort in the steady presence of someone who listened without judgment and offered advice without pushiness. "My mom never cooked," Emma confided one evening while Maria Elena prepared dinner. She knew how, but she was always too busy with charity events and social obligations. We ate out most of the time or had food delivered. Maria Elena nodded sympathetically while seasoning chicken for the oven. "Different families show love in different ways," she said diplomatically. "Your mother probably demonstrated her care in other forms." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this gentle reframe of what she had experienced as neglect. "I think she loved the idea of being a mother more than she loved actually doing it," she said finally. "Like she wanted to have children, because that's what wives do, but she didn't know what to do with us once we were here." It was a remarkably mature observation for a 17-year-old, and Maria Elena recognized the pain beneath Emma's analytical tone. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," she said carefully. "That doesn't mean the love wasn't real, just that they didn't know how to express it in ways you could understand." These conversations became a regular part of their routine. Emma would sit at the counter ostensibly working on homework while actually processing her feelings about her parents' divorce, her anxiety about college applications, and her fear that she was somehow responsible for her family's dysfunction. Maria Elena provided a steady, non-judgmental presence that allowed the girl to explore these complex emotions without feeling exposed or vulnerable. Jack's relationship with Maria Elena developed differently, but no less meaningfully. Where Emma sought verbal processing, Jack craved practical connection. He began helping with small tasks, carrying groceries, moving furniture, assisting with minor household repairs that were beyond Maria Elena's physical capabilities. These shared activities became opportunities for indirect communication, allowing them to build trust without the pressure of direct emotional conversation. One Saturday morning, Jack surprised everyone by appearing in the kitchen at 8 o'clock, fully dressed and alert. "Can you teach me to make those breakfast burritos?" he asked Maria Elena. "I want to learn something useful." The cooking lesson that followed became a revelation for Jack, who discovered that he enjoyed the focused attention required by food preparation. Chopping vegetables, seasoning eggs, timing the various components of the meal, these activities engaged his mind in ways that felt productive rather than overwhelming. More importantly, they provided a pathway for connection with Maria Elena that felt natural and unforced. "My mom tried to teach me to cook once," Jack said while grating cheese, "but she got frustrated when I didn't pick it up immediately. She said I wasn't paying attention, but really I was just nervous about disappointing her." Maria Elena watched his careful, methodical movements with the grater and recognized the perfectionism that came from a child who had learned to fear making mistakes. "Cooking isn't about being perfect," she assured him. "It's about nourishing people you care about. Even burned toast can taste good when it's made with love." As December progressed toward the holidays, the Caldwell family began to experience something they hadn't felt in years: anticipation for time spent together. Instead of the obligatory family gatherings that had characterized previous holidays, they found themselves actually looking forward to meals and conversations. The formal dining room was reclaimed from its role as expensive storage space and transformed into a place where real connection could occur. Richard, observing these changes with growing wonder, began to understand that Maria Elena's presence was catalyzing transformations he had given up hoping for. His children were engaging with him more openly, sharing their thoughts and concerns instead of offering only the minimal responses required by politeness. The house that had felt like a beautiful prison was becoming a home again, filled with the unpredictable vitality that came from people who felt safe enough to be authentically themselves. But perhaps the most profound change was occurring in Richard himself. The man who had built his identity around financial success and professional achievement was rediscovering parts of his personality that had been dormant for years. He laughed more easily, listened more attentively, and found himself caring about things that had nothing to do with profit margins or market fluctuations. He was remembering what it felt like to be a father, rather than simply a provider, a host, rather than just a homeowner. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. There were still difficult moments, still evidence of the deep wounds that had fractured the family's relationships. Emma's anxiety didn't disappear overnight. Jack's academic struggles continued, and Richard's tendency to retreat into work remained a challenge. But now these problems existed within a context of hope and connection rather than isolation and despair. As Christmas approached, Maria Elena found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in any of her previous positions: the sense that she belonged, not as an outsider serving a wealthy family, but as someone who had become integral to their healing and growth. The Caldwells needed her expertise in maintaining their household, but they also needed her wisdom, her perspective, and her gentle guidance back toward becoming the family they had the potential to be. It was a role she had never expected to play, but one that felt more meaningful than any job she had ever held. In helping the Caldwells rediscover their connection to each other, Maria Elena was also discovering new dimensions of her own capacity for impact and influence. She was learning that the skills she had developed through decades of service, patience, observation, emotional intelligence, and the ability to create comfort in the midst of chaos, were not just survival mechanisms but genuine gifts that could transform lives. The foundation was being laid for something beautiful and lasting, though none of them yet realized how thoroughly their growing bond would be tested in the months to come. On a quiet evening in mid-January, when the Christmas decorations had been carefully stored away and the house had settled back into its winter rhythms, Maria Elena made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything she had been building with the Caldwell family. It started with a memory, triggered by the scent of Emma's anxiety medication when she was helping to organize the girls' bathroom cabinet. That night, after returning to her small apartment in the Mission District, Maria Elena sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and allowed herself to remember things she had carefully kept locked away. Her own daughter Sophia, now 21 and thriving in her nursing program, had once been a teenager struggling with depression and anxiety. But before Sophia's academic success and career focus, there had been dark months when Maria Elena had feared losing her daughter to despair. The parallel was too strong to ignore. Emma's perfectionism, her social isolation, her physical symptoms of stress, they all echoed Sophia's teenage crisis. But where Maria Elena had felt helpless and alone during her daughter's struggle, she now had experience, wisdom, and perhaps most importantly, the trust of a family who was beginning to let her see their authentic selves. The next morning, Maria Elena arrived at the Caldwell mansion with a different kind of purposefulness. Instead of immediately beginning her housekeeping tasks, she prepared a special breakfast, not the usual efficient meal, but something that required her to stay in the kitchen longer, creating opportunities for the kind of extended conversation that had become precious to all of them. Emma appeared first, as had become her habit, drawn by the aromas of fresh bread and the comfort of Maria Elena's steady presence. But this morning, instead of settling into homework or casual conversation, Emma looked more fragile than usual, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "Mija," Maria Elena said gently, using the endearment that had become natural between them. "You look tired. Are you sleeping?" Emma's laugh held no humor. "Sleep is for people who don't have early admission applications due next week," she said, but her attempt at lightness couldn't disguise the genuine distress in her voice. "I'm fine. Just stressed about college stuff." Maria Elena continued her breakfast preparations in thoughtful silence, recognizing the signs of someone who needed to talk but wasn't sure how to begin. She had learned that the most important conversations often happened indirectly, alongside other activities that provided cover for emotional vulnerability. "My daughter Sophia went through something similar when she was your age," Maria Elena said quietly, not looking directly at Emma, but focusing on the egg she was scrambling. She was so determined to be perfect that she forgot to be human. Emma stiffened slightly, her defensive mechanisms engaging, but curiosity won over self-protection. "What happened?" she asked. "She made herself sick," Maria Elena replied honestly. "Not eating enough, not sleeping, pushing herself until her body started breaking down. She thought if she could just be good enough, smart enough, accomplished enough, then maybe her father would come back to us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with recognition. Emma had never explicitly connected her own drive for achievement with her parents' divorce, but hearing it stated so clearly made something click into place in her mind. "Did he come back?" Emma asked, her voice small. "No," Maria Elena said matter-of-factly, but Sophia learned that she couldn't earn love through performance. Love isn't a grade you achieve or a prize you win. It's something you deserve, simply by being yourself. Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing this perspective while Maria Elena finished preparing breakfast. Finally the girl spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering what I did wrong," she admitted. "Like if I had been a better daughter, maybe my mom wouldn't have left. Maybe if I get into Harvard or Stanford, she'll be proud enough to want to come back." Maria Elena turned from the stove and looked directly at Emma, her eyes soft but serious. "Oh, Mija," she said with infinite gentleness, "your mother's leaving had nothing to do with you. Adult pain is complicated and has nothing to do with how much they love their children." The conversation that followed was unlike any Emma had ever experienced with an adult. Maria Elena shared her own story, growing up poor in Mexico, immigrating to the United States as a young woman, marrying a man who eventually abandoned his responsibilities as a husband and father, raising Sophia alone while working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She spoke without self-pity or dramatic emphasis, simply offering her experiences as evidence that people could survive devastating disappointments and still find meaning and joy. "The hardest lesson I had to learn," Maria Elena said, "was that I couldn't control other people's choices. I could only control how I responded to them. I chose to focus on raising my daughter with love instead of bitterness, even when I was angry and scared and didn't know how we would pay rent." Emma found herself crying, not the careful, controlled tears she allowed herself in private, but deep, cleansing sobs that seemed to release months of accumulated fear and self-blame. Maria Elena didn't offer platitudes or try to stop the crying. Instead, she simply sat beside Emma and provided the kind of steady, unconditional presence that allowed the girl to finally feel safe enough to grieve. When Jack wandered into the kitchen 20 minutes later, he found his sister and Maria Elena sitting quietly together, Emma's eyes red but peaceful, Maria Elena's hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. Something in the atmosphere of the room, the quality of the silence, the sense of shared understanding, made him pause instead of immediately launching into his usual morning routine. "Everything okay?" he asked, his concern genuine despite his attempts to sound casual. "We were just talking about how hard it is to be human sometimes," Maria Elena replied, including him in the conversation without exposing Emma's vulnerability. Jack nodded, as if this made perfect sense, then surprised both Maria Elena and Emma by joining them at the counter, instead of taking his breakfast to another room. The three of them sat together in comfortable silence, sharing not just food, but the deeper nourishment that came from being truly seen and accepted. Richard appeared in the doorway during this quiet communion, and his expression shifted as he recognized the significance of what he was witnessing. His daughter, who had been carrying impossible burdens alone, was finally receiving the kind of emotional support she needed. His son, who typically isolated himself through humor and avoidance, had chosen connection over self-protection. And Maria Elena, who had started as their employee, had become something far more valuable, a source of wisdom and comfort that money couldn't buy. "Mind if I join you?" Richard asked, and there was something different in his voice, a humility that suggested he was asking for inclusion rather than assuming it. The breakfast that followed was quiet, but not awkward, thoughtful rather than tense. Emma seemed lighter, as if sharing her fears had reduced their power over her. Jack was more engaged than usual, asking questions about Maria Elena's experiences that showed genuine interest in her life beyond their household. Richard listened more than he spoke, observing the interactions between his children and this remarkable woman who had somehow become central to their emotional well-being. "Maria Elena," Richard said as they finished eating, "I know this goes beyond your job responsibilities, but I want you to know how grateful I am for the way you've been caring for Emma and Jack. Not just the practical things, but this." He gestured toward the peaceful scene around the table. "This is the first time in months that we've felt like a family." "Shh!" Maria Elena nodded acknowledgement of his gratitude, but her response revealed the depth of her own emotional investment. "They are good children," she said simply. "Sometimes good children just need someone to remind them that they're enough, exactly as they are." After the family dispersed to their respective activities, Maria Elena reflected on the morning's conversations while completing her regular tasks. She had crossed a line, moving from household employee to trusted confidant and emotional guide. It was territory she had never navigated in previous positions, both because other families hadn't needed her in this way, and because she had never felt secure enough in her employment to risk such emotional investment. But the Caldwells were different. Their wealth and privilege hadn't protected them from the fundamental human needs for connection, understanding, and unconditional acceptance. In some ways, their advantages had made them more vulnerable, creating expectations and pressures that compounded their emotional struggles. They needed the same things Maria Elena had learned to provide for her own daughter: a safe space to be imperfect, permission to feel their feelings without judgment, and the reassurance that they were lovable even in their most flawed moments. As she cleaned and organized the house that day, Maria Elena found herself praying, not the formal prayers of her childhood, but the heartfelt hopes of someone who had come to care deeply about the people she served. She prayed that Emma would learn to trust her own worth regardless of external validation. She prayed that Jack would find healthy ways to channel his sensitivity and intelligence. She prayed that Richard would discover that being a good father mattered more than being a successful businessman. And she prayed that she would have the wisdom and strength to continue offering what they needed, without losing sight of her own boundaries and well-being. The foundation of trust she had been building with the Caldwell family was becoming something unprecedented in her experience. Not just a job that paid well, but a relationship that enriched everyone involved. She was learning that her previous assumption about wealthy families had been incomplete. Money might insulate people from certain kinds of problems, but it couldn't protect them from the universal human experiences of loss, disappointment, and the deep need to matter to someone else. What she didn't yet realize was that her growing emotional investment would soon be tested in ways that would challenge everything she thought she understood about loyalty, trust, and the true cost of caring for people who lived in a world so different from her own. March arrived with the unpredictable weather that characterized San Francisco springs, sunny mornings that gave way to afternoon fog, warm days followed by chilly evenings, and with it came changes in the Caldwell household that reflected the family's continued emotional growth. Emma had been accepted to 3 excellent universities and was beginning to show excitement about her future rather than anxiety about meeting impossible standards. Jack's grades had improved significantly, not because Maria Elena had tutored him, but because her consistent encouragement had helped him develop confidence in his own abilities. Richard had made some subtle but meaningful adjustments to his business practices, establishing a more generous retirement fund for household staff and taking a more active role in his children's daily lives. The man who had previously scheduled even family interactions like business meetings was learning to be spontaneous, to prioritize presence over productivity. The house itself reflected these changes. Music played more often, flowers bloomed longer in their vases, and rooms that had served as elegant storage spaces were being reclaimed for actual living. The formal dining room hosted casual meals several times a week, filled with conversation and laughter, rather than the stilted politeness of obligatory family gatherings. Maria Elena had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and meaningful. Her official responsibilities remained unchanged, but her role had expanded organically to include emotional support, practical guidance, and the kind of steady, nurturing presence that helped each family member feel valued and understood. She looked forward to her days in the mansion not just because the pay was good, but because she had come to love the people she served, which made what happened on that gray Tuesday morning in late March all the more devastating. Maria Elena arrived at her usual time to find the household buzzing with an energy that felt different from the comfortable warmth she had come to expect. Mrs. Reynolds met her at the service door with an expression of barely contained urgency, and Maria Elena immediately knew something was wrong. "Mr. Caldwell wants to see you in his office immediately," Mrs. Reynolds said, her tone carefully neutral but her eyes conveying concern. Maria Elena's heart began to race as she made her way through the house, noting details that seemed ominous in hindsight. The kitchen was abnormally quiet. Emma and Jack were nowhere to be seen, unusual for a school day when they typically grabbed breakfast before leaving. The atmosphere felt charged with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Richard's home office, usually organized with the precision of a successful businessman, showed signs of disturbance. Papers were scattered across his desk, file cabinets stood open, and his expression was harsher than Maria Elena had seen since her first days of employment. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. Suspicion. "Maria Elena," he said, his voice formal in a way that immediately established distance. "We need to discuss some concerning developments." She remained standing, sensing that this was not a conversation that would benefit from assumed informality. "Of course, Mr. Caldwell," she replied, matching his formal tone while trying to control her growing anxiety. "Last night, I discovered that several valuable items are missing from the house," Richard continued, his businessman's composure barely concealing underlying anger. "A diamond bracelet that belonged to my mother, worth approximately $50,000. A gold watch that was a gift from my father. Some rare coins from my collection, valued at about $20,000. Maria Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she began to understand the implication of his words. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "What does this have to do with me?" Richard's expression grew colder. "You're the only person who has regular access to private areas of the house. The only one who would know where these items were kept and when the house would be empty." The accusation hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Maria Elena felt every lesson her mother had taught her about dignity in the face of injustice, every experience she had ever had of being presumed guilty because of her background and economic status, the careful relationship she had built with this family, the trust and affection that had developed over months of shared meals and honest conversations, was being incinerated by suspicion and class prejudice. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "I have never taken anything from your home except my paycheck. I would never steal from anyone, but especially not from people I care about." But Richard seemed unable to hear her words over the roar of his own fear and disappointment. The loss of these precious family heirlooms had triggered something deeper than anger about missing possessions. It had awakened his terror of being betrayed again, of having his trust exploited by someone he had allowed into his intimate life. "The evidence is circumstantial but compelling," he continued, his tone becoming more clinical as he retreated into the emotional protection of treating this like a business transaction. "You had opportunity and access. The missing items are easily portable and valuable, and frankly, your financial situation provides motive." Each word felt like a physical blow to Maria Elena. The man who had thanked her for caring for his children, who had shared quiet conversations about loss and healing, who had seemed to understand that her service came from the heart rather than mere economic necessity, was reducing her to a stereotype based on her class and ethnicity. "I understand that you need to investigate the situation," Maria Elena replied with as much dignity as she could muster, "but I cannot continue working in a house where I am not trusted." Richard's expression shifted slightly, as if some part of him recognized the injustice of what was happening, but his fear was too powerful to allow rational thought. "I think that would be best," he said, the words coming out more harshly than perhaps he intended. "Mrs. Reynolds will prepare your final paycheck." Maria Elena nodded once, her movements precise and controlled despite the devastation she felt. She had learned long ago not to beg, not to plead, not to debase herself by fighting accusations that said more about the accuser than the accused. Instead, she gathered what little personal belongings she kept at the house: a sweater, her lunch containers, a small plant Emma had given her, and prepared to leave behind the first job that had ever felt like more than economic survival. As she walked toward the service door, she encountered Emma in the hallway. The girl's face was streaked with tears, her eyes red from crying, and she looked at Maria Elena with an expression of absolute heartbreak. "This is wrong," Emma whispered, glancing around to make sure her father couldn't hear. "I know you didn't take those things. You would never do that." Maria Elena's composure nearly cracked at the sight of Emma's pain, but she forced herself to remain steady. "Sometimes life is unfair, Mija," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean you stop being good or stop believing in people." Jack appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale and his eyes reflecting the same disbelief as his sister's. He ran down to join them, his usual adolescent awkwardness replaced by genuine anguish. "Can't you explain to him?" Jack asked desperately. "Can't you make him understand?" Maria Elena looked at these two young people whom she had come to love like her own children, and felt her heart breaking not for herself, but for them. They were learning a painful lesson about how quickly love could be withdrawn, how easily trust could be destroyed by fear and prejudice. "Your father is scared," she explained gently. When people are scared, sometimes they make decisions that hurt innocent people. It doesn't mean he doesn't love you. It just means he's human and imperfect, like all of us. Emma threw her arms around Maria Elena in a fierce hug, her teenage reserve completely abandoned. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry this is happening." Maria Elena held her for a moment, memorizing the feel of this girl who had blossomed under her care, who had learned to trust herself and believe in her own worth. "You have nothing to apologize for," she whispered. "Continue being brave and kind. Don't let this make you bitter." Jack joined their embrace, and for a few precious seconds, the three of them held each other in the hallway of a house that had become home for all of them. Then Maria Elena gently extricated herself, knowing that prolonging the goodbye would only make it harder for everyone. Mrs. Reynolds waited by the service door with an envelope containing Maria Elena's final paycheck. Her expression was unreadable, but she pressed something additional into Maria Elena's hand. A business card with her personal contact information written on the back. "In case you need a reference," Mrs. Reynolds said quietly, and Maria Elena understood that even the head of staff, who had initially been skeptical of her presence, recognized the injustice of what was happening. The bus ride back to the Mission District felt like traveling between planets. Minutes ago, she had been an integral part of a family's healing process, a trusted confidant and emotional anchor. Now she was once again just another domestic worker who had lost her job, carrying her few possessions in a plastic bag and facing the uncertainty of unemployment. But as the familiar sights of her neighborhood came into view, the colorful murals, the street vendors, the sound of Spanish and laughter mixing in the air, Maria Elena felt something unexpected alongside her pain. She felt proud. Proud that she had maintained her dignity in the face of accusation, proud that she had tried to comfort Richard's children even as their father was destroying her life, proud that she had loved genuinely and served faithfully, regardless of how that service was ultimately valued. That evening, as she sat in her small apartment with a cup of tea and began the process of looking for new employment, Maria Elena allowed herself to grieve not just for the job she had lost, but for the family she had hoped to help heal. The Caldwells would have to find their way forward without her, and she could only hope that the foundation of love and trust she had helped them build would prove strong enough to survive this betrayal. She had no way of knowing that the truth would eventually surface, or that the man who had accused her so coldly would soon discover just how profoundly he had wronged someone who had offered him nothing but genuine care. For now, she could only wait, work, and trust that time would reveal the truth about both her innocence and her irreplaceable value to a family that had forgotten how to love. Summer arrived early in San Francisco that year, bringing with it the kind of clear, bright days that made the city's famous fog seem like a distant memory. But for Richard Caldwell, the season's warmth couldn't penetrate the cold that had settled over his house since Maria Elena's departure 3 months earlier. The mansion felt different now, not just quiet, but genuinely empty, as if something essential had been removed from its foundation. The practical changes were immediately obvious. Meals returned to their previous pattern of functional efficiency rather than thoughtful nourishment. The kitchen, once filled with inviting aromas and the sound of easy conversation, became merely a space for cooks' competent but uninspired meal preparation. Flowers wilted faster in their vases, rooms felt less lived in despite being perfectly maintained, and the atmospheric warmth that had gradually developed over Maria Elena's months of employment simply evaporated. But the emotional changes were far more devastating. Emma had retreated into a depression that went beyond typical teenage moodiness, her college acceptance letters providing little enthusiasm now that the person who had helped her believe in herself was gone. She moved through her daily routines like someone sleepwalking, polite but distant, cooperative but joyless. The anxiety that Maria Elena had helped her manage returned with a vengeance, manifesting in sleepless nights and a loss of appetite that worried even her typically self-absorbed father. Jack's response was more volatile. The sensitive boy who had begun to trust adults again became sullen and rebellious. his grades plummeting as he channeled his anger into deliberate self-sabotage. He spoke to his father only when absolutely necessary, his responses monosyllabic and hostile. The marijuana use that had been declining under Maria Elena's gentle influence resumed with concerning frequency, and Richard began receiving calls from school about Jack's disruptive behavior. Most painfully, the tentative family bonds that had been slowly reconstructing were completely severed. The breakfast conversations stopped. The shared dinners ceased, and each family member returned to their pattern of isolation. Richard found himself eating most meals alone in his office, his investment reports and financial statements providing cold comfort for the human connection he had lost. Mrs. Reynolds, observing these changes with the professional eye of someone who had managed households for decades, ventured to express her concerns during one of Richard's increasingly frequent discussions about staffing issues. "The children are struggling with Maria Elena's absence," she said carefully, choosing her words with diplomatic precision. "Perhaps it might be beneficial to consider—" "We've been over this," Richard interrupted, his tone sharp with defensiveness. The situation was handled appropriately given the circumstances. But even as he spoke these words, Richard felt their inadequacy. Deep in his heart, in the part of his consciousness that he tried to silence with financial reports and business meetings, he knew something was fundamentally wrong with his decision. The Maria Elena who had cared for his children with such genuine tenderness, who had brought warmth and healing into their lives, who had never asked for anything beyond fair wages and basic respect, that woman didn't fit the profile of someone who would steal family heirlooms for financial gain. The questions that plagued him during sleepless nights were becoming impossible to ignore. Why would someone in a stable, well-paying position risk everything for a few valuable items? Why would a woman who had shown such integrity in every other aspect of her service suddenly become a thief? And most troublingly, why had his accusations felt so wrong even as he was making them? The answer came on a humid afternoon in July, delivered in the most unexpected way possible. Richard was in his office reviewing quarterly investment reports when he heard shouting from the kitchen. Not the controlled professional tones typical of household staff, but genuine anger and distress. He rushed downstairs to find Cook standing over Mrs. Reynolds, both women's faces flushed with emotion. "I can't do this anymore," Cook was saying, her voice shaking with some combination of guilt and defiance. "That poor woman lost her job because of my stupidity, and I can't live with it." Mrs. Reynolds looked stricken, her usual composure completely abandoned. "Margaret, please think about what you're saying." "No." "Cook." "Margaret," interrupted. "I should have spoken up months ago. Mr. Caldwell deserves to know the truth." Richard stepped into the kitchen, and both women turned toward him with expressions that immediately told him his world was about to shift dramatically. "What truth?" he asked, though some part of him already dreaded the answer. Margaret took a shuddering breath before responding. "The missing jewelry and coins," she said quietly. "I took them. Not to steal, but because I have a gambling problem. I've been taking things from the house and pawning them to pay off debts, then lying about inventory and claiming things were missing." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his mind reeling as he processed the implications of Margaret's confession. "You let me accuse Maria Elena," he said slowly, his voice hollow with horror. "You let me fire her, destroy her reputation, ruin her life, and you said nothing." Margaret's face crumpled with shame. "I was scared," she whispered. "I knew if the truth came out I'd lose my job and probably face criminal charges. And she was. She was just the maid. I thought you'd hire someone else and move on." "Just the maid," Richard repeated, and the words tasted like poison in his mouth. He thought of Maria Elena's gentle hands preparing breakfast for his children, her patient listening when Emma shared her fears, her quiet wisdom when Jack struggled with adolescent confusion. He thought of the transformation she had facilitated in his family, the love she had given freely without expecting anything in return. "Mrs. Reynolds spoke into the silence that followed. Margaret came to me yesterday saying she couldn't bear the guilt anymore. We've been discussing how to handle the situation." "The situation," Richard said, his anger beginning to build, "is that an innocent woman was falsely accused, lost her livelihood, and had her reputation destroyed because of theft that someone else committed. There's no handling that makes it acceptable." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Margaret, you're terminated immediately. I want you out of the house within the hour. Mrs. Reynolds will provide information about addiction counseling services, and I won't press criminal charges if you enter treatment immediately and pay restitution for the items." Margaret nodded tearfully, seeming almost relieved that her secret was finally exposed. As she left to pack her belongings, Richard found himself alone with Mrs. Reynolds, who looked as devastated as he felt. "We need to find Maria Elena," he said quietly. "We need to apologize, offer her the position back, provide some kind of compensation for what she's endured." Mrs. Reynolds nodded, already reaching for her address book. "I have her contact information. But Mr. Caldwell, 3 months is a long time. She may have found other employment. She may not want to return to a house where she was treated so poorly." The possibility that Maria Elena might refuse his apology, might have moved on to a situation that valued and respected her properly, filled Richard with panic. The woman who had helped his family begin healing from Catherine's abandonment, who had shown Emma and Jack what unconditional acceptance looked like, who had demonstrated daily that genuine care couldn't be bought but had to be earned through consistency and respect, that woman might never return to their lives. That evening, Richard sat in his home office staring at Maria Elena's phone number, trying to find words adequate for the apology he needed to make. How do you ask forgiveness for such a profound betrayal of trust? How do you explain that fear and prejudice had temporarily overwhelmed judgment and decency? How do you rebuild a relationship after demonstrating such devastating failure of character? Emma appeared in his doorway, her expression hopeful for the first time in months. "Mrs. Reynolds told me what happened," she said quietly. "Are you going to call Maria Elena?" Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the toll these months had taken. The vibrant, confident young woman who had been emerging under Maria Elena's care had disappeared, replaced by someone who moved through her days mechanically, her joy extinguished by witnessing her father's cruel misjudgment. "I'm going to try," he said honestly. "But Emma, I need you to understand that she might not forgive us. She might not want to come back. What I did was unforgivable." Emma moved into the office and sat across from her father, her expression more serious than any 17-year-old should need to be. "She'll forgive you," Emma said with quiet certainty. "That's who she is. But Dad, you need to understand that you didn't just hurt her. You hurt Jack and me too. You showed us that even people we trust can abandon us when things get difficult." The accuracy of Emma's observation cut through Richard's guilt like a knife. In his eagerness to protect his family from what he perceived as betrayal, he had betrayed them himself, destroying a relationship that had been healing their deepest wounds. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it." Emma's expression softened slightly. "Don't apologize to me," she said. "Apologize to her and Dad. When you do, mean it. She deserves better than formal politeness. She deserves the truth about how much she means to us." As Emma left him alone with his phone and his regrets, Richard realized that the conversation he was about to attempt would be one of the most important of his life. Not because of its financial implications or business consequences, but because it would determine whether he could repair the damage he had inflicted on someone who had offered his family nothing but love, and whether his children could learn to trust him again after witnessing his capacity for such profound cruelty. The stakes weren't measured in dollars or investment returns, but in the far more valuable currency of human connection, dignity, and the possibility of redemption. The phone rang 3 times before Maria Elena answered, her voice cautious as she responded to an unfamiliar number calling at 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening. When Richard identified himself, the silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity, though it probably lasted only a few seconds. "Mr. Caldwell," she said finally, her tone carefully neutral, maintaining the professional distance that had once existed between them before months of shared humanity had created something deeper. "Maria Elena," Richard began, then found himself unable to continue. "How do you compress months of regret, guilt, and newfound understanding into a phone conversation? How do you explain that discovering your own capacity for such devastating misjudgment has left you questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself?" "I know why you're calling," Maria Elena said quietly, sparing him the struggle to find adequate words. "Mrs. Reynolds contacted me this afternoon. She told me about Margaret's confession." Richard felt simultaneously relieved and ashamed that she already knew the truth. "Maria Elena, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. What I did to you was unconscionable. I let fear and prejudice override everything I knew about your character and integrity." "Yes," she agreed simply, offering no immediate absolution. "You did." The stark honesty of her response, devoid of polite platitudes or face-saving language, forced Richard to confront the full magnitude of his actions. "I understand if you can never forgive me," he continued, "but I needed you to know that I recognize how profoundly I wronged you, and that the fault was entirely mine." Maria Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Richard found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent months processing betrayal and disappointment. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I have worked for many families over the years. I have been invisible, overlooked, and sometimes treated rudely. But what happened in your house was different. You didn't just fire an employee. You destroyed someone who cared about your family, someone who had invested emotionally in your children's well-being, someone who considered herself part of your household's healing." Each word landed with precision, not delivered with cruelty, but with the devastating accuracy of absolute truth. Richard felt his eyes filling with tears as he began to fully comprehend the scope of his betrayal. "You're right," he whispered. "I destroyed something precious, and I don't know how to repair it." "That's the problem with trust," Maria Elena replied. "Once it's broken, it can never be exactly the same. Even if it heals, there's always a scar." The finality in her voice made Richard panic, fearing that she was ending the conversation permanently. "Maria Elena, please. My children, Emma and Jack, have been devastated since you left. Emma is depressed, Jack is failing school, and they both blame me for driving away the person who was helping them heal from their mother's abandonment. They need you." "What about you?" Maria Elena asked, and something in her tone suggested this was an important question. "Do you need me, Mr. Caldwell, or are you just trying to solve a staffing problem?" It was the question Richard had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. In the months since Maria Elena's departure, he had focused on the practical problems her absence created and the guilt over his unjust accusations, but he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge his own personal loss, the way her steady presence had anchored not just his household, but his own emotional stability. "I need you," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Not as an employee, but as— I don't know what to call it. A friend? A member of our family? Someone who saw the best in us even when we couldn't see it ourselves." Maria Elena was quiet again, and Richard could hear the sound of her breathing, could imagine her in her small apartment in the Mission District, weighing his words against months of hurt and practical considerations. "If I came back," she said finally, "things would have to be different. Not just the salary, though, that would need to reflect my actual contributions to your household, but the respect, the trust, the recognition that I'm not just hired help, but someone whose judgment and feelings matter." "Yes," Richard said immediately. "Whatever you need, whatever makes this right." "I don't know if anything can make it completely right," Maria Elena replied honestly. "But maybe we can build something new, something better than what we had before. They talked for another hour, working through practical details and emotional boundaries. Maria Elena would return in 2 weeks, giving Richard time to process Margaret's departure and giving herself time to finish some obligations she had undertaken during her unemployment. Her salary would be increased substantially, reflecting not just her household management skills, but her role as an emotional anchor for the family. Most importantly, Richard would need to have honest conversations with Emma and Jack about his mistakes and his commitment to treating Maria Elena with the respect she deserved. When they finally ended the call, Richard felt simultaneously hopeful and terrified. Maria Elena was giving them another chance, but he understood that it would truly be their last opportunity to get this relationship right. If he failed again, if he allowed fear or prejudice to override his better judgment, he would lose not just an exceptional employee, but someone who had become integral to his family's capacity for love and healing. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard found himself preparing for Maria Elena's return with an intensity that surprised him. He researched addiction counseling programs to help Margaret, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because he wanted to understand how fear and desperation could lead someone to make such destructive choices. He had extensive conversations with Emma and Jack about trust, forgiveness, and the importance of treating all people with dignity regardless of their economic status or background. Most difficult, he forced himself to examine the prejudices and assumptions that had led to his catastrophic misjudgment. Why had it been so easy for him to believe that Maria Elena, who had shown nothing but integrity and compassion, would suddenly become a thief? What unconscious biases about class and ethnicity had made him assume guilt rather than innocence? The answers were uncomfortable but necessary. He realized that, despite his genuine affection for Maria Elena, he had never fully seen her as his equal. Some part of him had always maintained the employer-employee distance that allowed him to reduce her to a stereotype when fear overwhelmed reason. If he wanted to rebuild their relationship on a foundation strong enough to withstand future challenges, he would need to examine and change these deeply ingrained attitudes. Emma and Jack spent those 2 weeks in a state of anxious anticipation, afraid to hope too much, but unable to contain their excitement about Maria Elena's return. They cleaned their rooms without being asked, helped Mrs. Reynolds prepare the guest room where Maria Elena sometimes rested during long days, and counted down the days until the person who had helped them feel safe and loved would be back in their lives. The morning of Maria Elena's return, Richard found himself awake before dawn, checking and rechecking arrangements, making sure the house was perfect, trying to create conditions that might begin to express the depth of his regret and gratitude. When she rang the service bell at precisely 7 o'clock, he was waiting in the kitchen, his hands shaking slightly as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions and the possibility of redemption. Maria Elena stepped through the door carrying the same worn leather purse, wearing a similar simple dress, looking exactly as she had on her first day of employment 8 months earlier. But something fundamental had changed in the way she carried herself. There was a new strength in her posture, a quiet confidence that suggested she understood her own value in ways that couldn't be undermined by other people's prejudices. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, meeting his eyes directly, waiting to see what kind of man he had become during their months apart. "Good morning, Maria Elena," he replied. "Welcome home." The word home hung in the air between them, not the mansion, not the job site, but home. A place where she belonged not as a servant, but as someone essential to the family's well-being, someone whose presence was a gift rather than a service that could be purchased. It was, Richard realized, the first completely honest thing he had said to her in their entire relationship. And judging by the slight softening of Maria Elena's expression, it might just be enough to begin rebuilding what his fear and prejudice had destroyed. The months following Maria Elena's return unfolded like a slow, careful dance of rebuilding trust. She approached her renewed employment with professional competence but emotional caution, observing the family's dynamics to see if genuine change had occurred during their separation. Richard, meanwhile, struggled with his own transformation, fighting against ingrained patterns of privilege and control as he learned to see Maria Elena not as an employee, but as an equal partner in creating their home's emotional environment. The most immediate changes were practical. Maria Elena's salary had been increased substantially, reflecting Richard's recognition that her contributions went far beyond typical household management. She was given more autonomy in organizing family schedules and making decisions about daily routines, signaling a shift from hierarchical employer-employee relationship to collaborative partnership. Most significantly, Richard began asking for her opinions on family matters, acknowledging that her insights into Emma and Jack's emotional needs were often more accurate than his own. Emma and Jack's reactions to Maria Elena's return were complex mixtures of joy, relief, and wariness. The months of her absence had taught them painful lessons about how quickly love could be withdrawn, how adults they trusted could make devastating mistakes, and how their own happiness often depended on forces beyond their control. While they welcomed her back with genuine enthusiasm, both children remained somewhat guarded, unconsciously protecting themselves against the possibility of another traumatic abandonment. Maria Elena understood this dynamic intuitively and responded with the patient consistency that had originally won their trust. She resumed preparing the thoughtful breakfast that brought the family together, listening to Emma's college anxieties without judgment, helping Jack organize his chaotic academic and social life. But she also maintained appropriate boundaries, avoiding the complete emotional investment that had made her previous departure so devastating for everyone involved. The real test of their rebuilt relationship came in November during Emma's final college application season. The stress of essays, interviews, and decisions about her future triggered a return of the anxiety that Maria Elena had previously helped her manage. But this time, instead of suffering alone or relying entirely on Maria Elena's support, Emma approached both her father and Maria Elena together, creating a support system that didn't depend on any single person's presence. "I'm scared," Emma admitted during one of their kitchen conversations, "not just about getting accepted, but about leaving home, about starting over in a place where nobody knows me." Richard, who might previously have responded with practical advice about applications and academic strategies, instead listened carefully before speaking. "When your mother left," he said quietly, "I thought the scariest thing would be managing our lives without her. But the scariest thing was actually learning how to be a family differently." Maria Elena nodded approvingly, recognizing Richard's emotional growth in his willingness to acknowledge vulnerability. "Change is always frightening," she added. "But Emma, you've already survived the hardest change, your parents' divorce, and you've become stronger because of it." These conversations, involving all three of them as equals in addressing family challenges, represented a fundamental shift in their relationship dynamics. Richard was learning to be emotionally present rather than simply financially supportive. Maria Elena was offering wisdom and perspective while avoiding the trap of becoming the family's only source of emotional stability. Emma was discovering that she could seek support without surrendering her independence. Jack's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The sensitive boy who had taken refuge in anger and rebellion after Maria Elena's initial departure was maturing into a thoughtful young man capable of acknowledging his mistakes and making conscious changes in his behavior. His academic performance improved steadily, not because anyone was pressuring him, but because he had rediscovered confidence in his own abilities. One afternoon in December, Jack approached Richard and Maria Elena with a request that surprised both of them. "I want to learn about investing," he said, "not because I want to be rich, but because I want to understand how money works so I can make better decisions about my life." The financial education sessions that followed became unexpected bonding opportunities for Richard and Jack. Richard discovered that teaching his son about markets, risk management, and long-term planning gave him a way to share his professional expertise while building personal connection. Jack learned that his father's work involved more than moving money around. It required analytical thinking, emotional discipline, and careful attention to how individual decisions affected larger systems. Maria Elena observed these developments with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that her return had catalyzed changes that went far beyond her own relationship with the family. Richard was becoming the father his children needed, present and engaged, rather than distant and controlling. Emma and Jack were developing emotional resilience that would serve them throughout their lives. The family was healing not just from Catherine's abandonment, but from the deeper patterns of disconnection that had made her departure so devastating. But perhaps the most significant change was in Maria Elena herself. The experience of being falsely accused, losing a job she loved, and then being asked to return had taught her important lessons about her own value and agency. She no longer saw herself as someone whose worth depended entirely on other people's approval or whose security required accepting unfair treatment to maintain employment. This newfound confidence expressed itself in subtle but meaningful ways. She spoke up more frequently during family discussions, offering opinions on everything from vacation planning to household policies. She set clearer boundaries about her time and responsibilities, ensuring that her care for the family didn't come at the expense of her own well-being. Most importantly, she maintained relationships and interests outside the Caldwell household, preventing the total emotional investment that had made her previous departure so traumatic. As the holidays approached, Richard found himself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred in their household over the past year. The mansion that had once felt like a beautiful prison was now genuinely a home, filled with laughter, honest conversation, and the complex but rewarding work of people learning to love each other across differences in background and experience. The Christmas morning that had once been awkward exchanges of expensive gifts became a celebration of shared meals, spontaneous laughter, and the simple pleasure of being together. Emma, accepted to her top-choice university, but now genuinely excited rather than anxious about her future, helped Maria Elena prepare a feast that combined traditional American holiday foods with Mexican specialties that honored Maria Elena's heritage. Jack, his grades stabilized and his future looking promising, spent the morning teaching Richard card games Maria Elena had learned as a child. The living room, once a formal display space used only for entertaining business associates, was reclaimed as a place where the family gathered to watch movies, play games, and engage in the kind of spontaneous conversation that creates lasting memories. The expensive furniture was still beautiful, but now it served its intended purpose, providing comfort for people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As Maria Elena watched the Caldwells enjoying their holiday celebration, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with her salary or job security. She had helped a broken family learn to heal, not through magic or manipulation, but through the patient application of the lessons she had learned in her own life. That love expressed through service is one of the most powerful forces in human experience, that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their economic status, and that the most profound transformations often begin with the simplest acts of care. The year that had started with such promise, been disrupted by betrayal and misunderstanding, and rebuilt through forgiveness and mutual respect, was ending with the kind of peace that money cannot buy, but must be earned through the daily choice to treat each other with kindness, honesty, and grace. The spring that followed Emma's graduation from high school brought changes that tested all of their emotional growth. But this time they navigated transitions as a united family, rather than isolated individuals. Emma's departure for college, which could have triggered another crisis of abandonment and loss, instead became a celebration of success and a demonstration of healthy independence. Richard had learned to express pride without pressure, supporting Emma's choices while allowing her to make her own decisions. When she chose to attend a university across the country rather than staying close to home, he managed his own anxiety about her distance without trying to control her decision through guilt or financial manipulation. "I'm proud of you," he told her during one of their final father-daughter conversations before her departure. "Not just for your academic success, but for becoming someone who knows her own mind and has the courage to follow her dreams." Emma, who had once craved her father's approval desperately, now received his praise with quiet confidence. "I learned that from watching you change," she replied. "You showed me that people can grow and become better versions of themselves at any age." Maria Elena's role in Emma's college preparation was characteristically practical and emotional. She helped Emma select clothes appropriate for a different climate, taught her basic cooking skills that would serve her in dormitory life, and most importantly, assured her that their relationship would continue regardless of geographical distance. "You will always have a home here," Maria Elena promised during their goodbye conversation. "Not just a room to sleep in when you visit, but people who love you unconditionally and want to hear about your adventures." Jack, now a junior in high school and much more emotionally stable than he had been 2 years earlier, surprised everyone by taking a leadership role in Emma's departure preparations. He helped her pack, researched her new city to provide practical advice about transportation and local culture, and even initiated conversations about how they would stay connected despite the distance. The maturity he demonstrated during this transition reflected his growth from an angry, isolated adolescent into a thoughtful young man, capable of supporting others, even when experiencing his own emotions about change. The household that had once functioned through avoidance and emotional distance was now able to process difficult feelings together, creating space for sadness about separation while celebrating the growth that made it necessary. Emma's actual departure was emotional but not devastating. There were tears, long hugs, and promises to call regularly, but also excitement about new adventures and confidence that their family bonds were strong enough to withstand physical distance. Richard drove Emma to the airport personally, using the time for final conversations about money management, personal safety, and staying connected to family values while exploring independence. Maria Elena prepared a care package of homemade treats and family photos, practical gifts that would remind Emma of home's warmth without creating pressure to return prematurely. Her farewell advice was characteristically wise. Remember that growing up doesn't mean leaving love behind. It means learning to carry it with you wherever you go. With Emma settled into college life, the household dynamic shifted but remained healthy. Richard and Jack developed a closer relationship, built on shared interests in financial markets and sports, but grounded in the emotional honesty they had learned through their family's trials. Jack began talking about his own college plans and career interests, showing the kind of forward-thinking optimism that had been completely absent during his parents' divorce. Maria Elena found her role evolving once again, but this time the changes felt natural and positive. With only one child remaining at home, her household management responsibilities decreased slightly, allowing her more time for the community volunteer work that had always been important to her. Richard not only approved of her outside commitments but actually contributed financially to some of the organizations she supported, demonstrating his growing understanding that her value extended far beyond their individual household. The most significant development came in late spring, when Richard made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. During a family dinner conversation about Jack's upcoming senior year and college applications, Richard mentioned that he was considering reducing his work hours to spend more time on family and community involvement. "I've spent 20 years building wealth as if it were the most important thing in the world," he said thoughtfully. "But this past year has taught me that relationships matter more than returns on investment. I want to be present for Jack's final year at home, and I want to explore what else I might contribute to the world besides financial success." Jack looked up from his dinner with genuine surprise. "You mean you might actually come to some of my baseball games?" he asked, half joking but with real hope in his voice. "All of them, if you want me there," Richard replied seriously. "I've missed too many important moments because I thought making money was the same as taking care of my family." Maria Elena smiled approvingly, recognizing the profound shift in priorities that Richard was articulating. The man who had once defined himself entirely through financial achievement was discovering that personal fulfillment required different investments: time, attention, emotional presence, and the willingness to value relationships over transactions. As the year progressed, Richard's transformation became increasingly evident. He attended Jack's games, not just as an obligatory parental duty, but as someone genuinely interested in his son's experiences and friendships. He reduced his investment portfolio management to focus on more personally meaningful business ventures, including a foundation that supported educational opportunities for children from low-income families. Most significantly, he began treating Maria Elena not just as a valued employee, but as a trusted advisor whose insights about family, community, and life priorities genuinely influenced his decision-making. When the foundation board needed someone with direct experience in the communities they wanted to serve, Richard asked Maria Elena to consider joining as a consultant, recognizing that her background and perspective were exactly what the organization needed. "I know you already have a full-time job," he said when making the proposal, "but your understanding of what families really need, what makes the difference between surviving and thriving, is something I can't get from other board members." Maria Elena's decision to accept the consulting position marked another milestone in their relationship's evolution. She was no longer just someone who worked in Richard's house, she was someone whose expertise and judgment he sought in his professional life. The foundation work allowed her to use her experiences in service of broader social change, while the additional income provided her with financial security she had never previously enjoyed. Emma's phone calls from college reflected her awareness of these positive changes. "Dad sounds different," she told Maria Elena during one of their weekly conversations. "Happier, more relaxed. Like he's finally figured out what actually matters. Tati." "He had to lose some things to appreciate what he had," Maria Elena replied. "Sometimes that's how wisdom comes, through mistakes that teach us what we couldn't learn any other way." As Jack's senior year approached, he was no longer the angry, rebellious teenager who had used drugs and poor grades to express his pain about his parents' divorce. Instead, he was becoming a thoughtful young man with clear goals for his future and healthy relationships with both his father and Maria Elena. His college applications reflected genuine interests rather than simply following expected paths, and his essays demonstrated emotional maturity that impressed admissions officers. The family that had been shattered by Catherine's abandonment and nearly destroyed by Richard's prejudiced accusations had rebuilt itself into something stronger and more genuine than what had existed before. They had learned that love expressed through daily actions was more valuable than grand gestures, that trust had to be earned through consistency rather than demanded through authority, and that the most profound healing often came from unlikely sources. As Maria Elena reflected on the journey they had all traveled together, she realized that her presence in the Caldwell household had been transformative for everyone involved, including herself. She had arrived as a domestic worker seeking stable employment and had become a catalyst for emotional growth, a bridge between different worlds, and a living example of how dignity, patience, and compassion could overcome prejudice and misunderstanding. The mansion on Broadway was no longer just a house where wealthy people lived in isolation from each other and from the broader community. It had become a home where people from different backgrounds had learned to love and respect each other, where service was mutual rather than hierarchical, and where the true measure of wealth was calculated not in dollars but in the quality of relationships and the depth of human connection. 2 years later, on a brilliant October morning that painted San Francisco Bay in shades of gold and silver, Maria Elena stood in the Caldwell Mansion's kitchen, preparing what had become her favorite meal of the week, Sunday brunch for a family that had grown far beyond its original boundaries. Emma was home for her fall break from college, her confidence and independence evident in everything from her posture to her easy laughter. Jack was beginning his senior year of high school with college acceptances already in hand and a maturity that impressed everyone who met him. But the most significant change was in the kitchen itself, which had been renovated not for greater luxury, but for greater functionality. Richard had insisted on installing a large island where multiple people could cook together, acknowledging that meal preparation had become a family activity rather than a solitary chore. The formal dining room had been converted into a library and study space, while the breakfast nook had been expanded to accommodate the extended family that gathered regularly around their table. Extended family now included Sophia, Maria Elena's daughter, who had graduated from nursing school and landed a position at UCSF Medical Center. Her presence at family meals was natural and welcomed, representing the full integration of Maria Elena's life into the Caldwell household, rather than the compartmentalization that had characterized her previous employment relationships. Also present that morning was Mrs. Chen from Maria Elena's neighborhood in the Mission, an elderly woman whose grandson Jack was tutoring in mathematics. Cross-cultural friendships had developed organically as the Caldwells became genuinely interested in Maria Elena's community rather than simply employing her services. Richard moved through the kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had learned to find joy in domestic tasks. The man who had once viewed cooking as beneath his status now took pride in his ability to prepare ingredients, time various dishes to finish simultaneously, and contribute meaningfully to the collaborative effort of nourishing people he loved. "Emma," he called to his daughter, who was setting the expanded table, "tell us about your internship at the community health clinic. Maria Elena was asking about it yesterday." Emma's face lit up as she described her work with underserved populations, her growing understanding of how social and economic factors affected health outcomes, and her increasing certainty that she wanted to pursue medicine with a focus on community health. Her career choice reflected the value she had absorbed not just from her privileged education, but from watching Maria Elena's dedication to service and Sophia's commitment to healing. "I'm learning that the best healthcare happens when providers understand their patients' whole lives," Emma explained, "not just their medical symptoms. Maria Elena taught me that people need to be seen and respected as individuals, regardless of their economic status." Jack, no longer the sullen adolescent who had struggled with his parents' divorce, was now a thoughtful young man who had developed his own commitment to social engagement. His senior project focused on financial literacy education for low-income high school students, combining his inherited facility with numbers with his learned understanding of how economic inequality affected families like Maria Elena's. "I want to study business," he announced during their meal, "but not just to make money. I want to figure out how financial systems can work for everyone, not just people who already have wealth." Richard listened to his son's aspirations with pride that was untainted by his own agenda. The man who had once assumed Jack would follow directly in his footsteps was learning to celebrate his children's independence and their commitment to values that sometimes challenged his own assumptions. "Your grandfather would be proud," Richard said quietly. "He always believed that privilege came with responsibilities, though I forgot that lesson for a lot of years." Maria Elena, watching this family conversation with deep satisfaction, reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The Caldwells' wealth hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer their defining characteristic. Richard's investment portfolio continued to perform well, his properties maintained their value, and his financial security was unquestionable. But these assets now served purposes beyond mere accumulation, funding education, supporting community organizations, and creating opportunities for people who had been systematically excluded from economic advancement. More importantly, the family's emotional wealth had grown exponentially. They had learned to communicate honestly about difficult feelings, to support each other through challenges without trying to control outcomes, and to find joy in simple pleasures that didn't require expensive purchases. The mansion remained beautiful and comfortable, but it was no longer a fortress protecting them from authentic human connection. As the meal concluded, and various family members and friends began the familiar routine of clearing dishes and storing leftovers, Maria Elena experienced the deep contentment that comes from seeing one's work bear fruit across generations. Emma and Jack were becoming adults who understood that service to others was not a burden, but a privilege, that wealth created obligations as well as opportunities, and that the most meaningful lives were built through relationships rather than accumulations. Richard had evolved from a man who measured success solely through financial metrics into someone who understood that true prosperity included emotional health, community connection, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to other people's well-being. His business ventures now prioritized social impact alongside profit, and his personal relationships were characterized by mutuality rather than hierarchy. Perhaps most significantly, Maria Elena herself had discovered that her years of service had prepared her not just to maintain other people's households, but to help transform their understanding of what it meant to live well. Her work with Richard's Foundation had expanded into consulting with other organizations focused on economic justice and community development. Her insights about the daily realities of working-class families informed policy discussions and program development, giving her a voice in decisions that affected thousands of people in situations similar to her own background. Maria Elena, Sophia said as they worked together to wrap leftover food, "Remember when I was in high school and I used to complain about you working for rich families? I thought you were wasting your talents taking care of people who didn't appreciate you." Maria Elena smiled at the memory of her daughter's teenage indignation. "You weren't entirely wrong," she replied, "but you also weren't entirely right. Sometimes we have to work within systems to change them. And sometimes the most powerful transformations happen one relationship at a time." Emma overheard this conversation and joined them at the kitchen counter. "I hope you know," she said to Maria Elena, "that you didn't just take care of our family. You saved us. We were so lost after Mom left, so angry and disconnected. Without you, I don't think we would have learned how to love each other again." Jack appeared beside his sister, nodding agreement. "You taught us that family isn't just about being related to each other. It's about choosing to care for people consistently, even when it's difficult or inconvenient." Richard, the last to join their kitchen conversation, listened to his children's tributes with visible emotion. "Maria Elena," he said quietly, "I know I've thanked you before, but I need you to understand something. When I accused you of theft, when I let my fear and prejudice override everything I knew about your character, I thought I was protecting my family. Instead, I nearly destroyed the best thing that had happened to us since Catherine left." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "You had every right never to forgive me, never to return to a house where you had been treated so poorly. The fact that you gave us another chance, that you helped us rebuild not just our household but our capacity to trust and love each other, is the most generous gift anyone has ever given us." Maria Elena looked around the kitchen at these people who had become far more than employers, who had allowed her to be far more than an employee. "We all needed healing," she said simply. "We all made mistakes. We all learned to do better. That's what families do. They grow together." As the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, casting warm light across the gathered faces, Maria Elena felt the deep peace that comes from work well done and love freely given and received. The Mission District apartment where she returned each evening was still small and modest, but it was now supplemented by financial security and professional recognition that allowed her to support not just her own family, but her broader community as well. More importantly, she had learned that her capacity for service was not a limitation, but a strength, that her ability to see potential for growth in wounded people was a genuine gift, and that the relationships formed through consistent, respectful care could transcend all the artificial barriers created by class, ethnicity, and economic status. The Caldwell mansion was still impressively large, still filled with valuable artwork and expensive furnishings, still located in one of San Francisco's most exclusive neighborhoods. But it was no longer a monument to wealth or a fortress protecting privilege from reality. It had become something more valuable than any material possession, a home where people from different worlds had learned to love each other, not despite their differences, but because of what those differences taught them about the fullness of human experience. And have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without ever saying it? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your soul, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs hope today. For more emotional stories like this, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for joining us on this journey of the heart. We'll see you in our next story. As Maria Elena walked to the bus stop that evening, she carried with her not just her purse and the leftover food the family had insisted she take home, but also the profound satisfaction of understanding her own worth and the transformative power of love expressed through daily service. The fog was beginning to roll in from the Pacific, softening the edges of the city and creating the kind of ethereal beauty that made Sa